right, welcome everyone. As mentioned, today we'll be going over the devices pillar in the zero trust model. So let me get my screen shared out and we'll get moving. This is just an example of the pillars that we'll be going over in order, ideally. Obviously, we're on the second one here for devices, where that plays into the entire zero trust models down here in the bottom left corner. These are your endpoints, and we'll be going over device compliance as well as enhancing the request. That's actually going to zero trust policies that you develop yourself or have implemented within your organization to control based on these metrics. So we'll kind of go over how that's set up and how it all kind of works together. So to start, the device pillar and zero trust model is a crucial aspect of the overall security framework. Zero trust, obviously the security concept centered on the belief that organizations will be compromised and that nothing can be trusted, even if it's already within your environment, and even if it's already authenticated. The entire idea is anytime they access a resource, you are checking who they are, where they're coming from. Is your device one of ours? Is it in compliance? Does it meet our thresholds for access? So you'd be amazed at how much stuff that will stop once in place. The device pillar specifically focuses on ensuring the security of all devices that access the network. We'll kind of get into compliance around your devices here as well, whether they are corporate owned or BYOD. And that's kind of important because you can use this model for BYOD. It just takes a little bit of build out and some limitations around iOS and stuff that we'll kind of get into. In the context of device pillar, the following key principles are what's important, and these are the ones we'll be going over today. That's device identity and authentication. It's device compliance and health checks. It's your least privileged access of those devices. It's the continuous monitoring and the adaptation of your security policies against that health monitoring of those devices. And lastly, the segmentation / microsegmentation of your services and or network so that in the event of a full compromise, they are still limited in terms of availability to information that you're trying to control. All right, so to start, we're going to be going over the Intune kind of configuration panels. We'll be going over configuration profiles, compliance policies, how you handle patching, the two options for patching, as well as some kind of tips and tricks that we've learned to apply over the years that Microsoft doesn't really tell you around Intune enrollments, around onboarding, and the limitations there within. We're also going to be going over actual enrollments for BYOD, as well as general enrollments, all the different kind of options around the different operating systems, what to kind of look out for, the kind of gotchas and things that you won't really anticipate that you'll run into should you roll out these solutions. So to start, let's go ahead and get promoted. Those that are familiar with our first one know that we are running privileged identity management, and as such, I am not an administrator until I request so. And that request has to be justified. Thankfully, I'm the one that approves the request, so I don't have to approve myself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go global admin so we don't have to worry about anything, but generally we can also use our Intune administrator role. So we're only need 2.5 hours. This is going to be for the webinar demo on device zero trust. Okay, I'm going to get that activated. All right, and now let's go to our Intune portal. There are two ways you can access this. It's intune.microsoft.com or endpoint.microsoft.com. Either one should take you straight there. So what we're going to do is kind of go over this dashboard as well as kind of things to look at. Some of this actually kind of purposely left open so we can kind of go over it together. For example, we have a few devices that are not in our compliance. We're going to kind of walk through that here shortly once we get to the compliance piece of this. So to start, we're going to go down the road of the device identity authentication and configuration of these devices. Those are what's considered configuration profiles. Configuration profiles are broken down into two different areas, but these are generally your policies that determine what applications are deployed, certain settings, restrictions on the devices. These are basically your application deployments as well as your security settings for your different use cases. Those of you that are coming from legacy solutions like group policy for your device restrictions and for your surface area reduction rules, for example, there is tooling in here to facilitate the conversion from group policy to Intune policies, or to configuration policies as they're called here. That's this group policy analytics. This allows you to actually export your existing group policies that would exist within your environment, bring them in here by importing them, and they will try to line up the corresponding Intune policy for that group policy and create the configuration profiles for you. So you can see here we have, like, for example, some of the CIS member server standards. About 80% of those are supported by MDM. And so you can get a list of the ones that are not, that may need to still be controlled either through a script that's ran or through other type of control mechanism. They're just not natively built into it. But this is super important if you're thinking about moving away from group policy. Either you're getting tired of dealing with the 4-hour window rollover times, or for remote users having to get those settings over VPN, etc. This is a huge tool to facilitate the conversion of any existing policies you have into Intune. Anything that's past that and any additional things that you'd like to roll out can be done through configuration policies. These are everything from your Defender for Endpoint configurations to your rolling out of certain baseline restrictions of devices have to be encrypted. Any number of policies that you create, they're broken down into 2 different sections generally for the Windows side of things, and that is your settings catalog and templates. Your settings catalog is going to be a lot closer to what you're used to in terms of group policy. But if you're not coming from a group policies perspective, I would highly suggest using the actual templates and selecting the corresponding areas. It's going to be a little bit faster for you to get your settings together. All right. So let's get back out of there and let's go to compliance. This is going to be the fun part. Everyone's on this call is more than likely already aware that the vast majority of MDMs can push out applications as well as ensure that your devices are at least adhering to your configuration policies. Dirty secret around the MDM industry is that no MDM can magically do something that other MDMs can't outside of very narrow use cases, and that is because they're always limited by the manufacturer. So, for example, VMware or now what are the other ones? Why can I remember the one named Iron something? Anyway, any of the other MDM providers, such as Intune, Jamf, etc., can only do what the manufacturer of the operating system allows them to do through these control mechanisms outside of their sidecar items. So, for example, Windows has a huge advantage because they make Windows. Microsoft makes Windows. So obviously, Microsoft's solution for Intune can do a little bit more than, say, other MDM providers could do around the Windows stack. But outside of those narrow use cases, there's not really much difference. So try to keep that in mind. In terms of MDM limitations, the real kind of catch around the MDM limitations are, do they actually integrate with your other solutions around this zero trust model? Because as we get into compliance and this threat protection risk assessment, we're going to kind of explain how if a machine is, for example, found to be infected, have an alert on it, that will actually change their compliance status and prevent them from accessing company data. Something that can be done with other MDM solutions and other AV solutions, but with a little bit of configuration that we'll kind of get into. In terms of just being able to bolt it on and be done with it, Microsoft's definitely a route to go. All right, so compliance policies. Compliance is a fun little area where we get to define the bare minimum requirements for certain devices. So, for example, if we have a plow equipment here, this is the bare minimum, has to be met. Otherwise, you cannot access anything out here at plow. Basically, your machine has to have BitLocker and has to be encrypted. It has to have a TPM chip. Your device has to be running. Spyware has to be running. Defender has to be onboarded and up to date, and you have to be real-time protected. And you have to have a Defender endpoint score of less than a low risk, meaning absolutely no risk. This Defender for endpoint piece is what I was kind of hinting at that we're going to be going over here shortly. Is a direct integration to Defender for endpoint. If an alert is found on a device, it will actually change their risk score, which then breaks their compliance, which then going back to our whole setup here, if we have a conditional access policy set to not allow device risk of that, then they are hard blocked until they bring that machine into compliance. Now, where compliance gets really, really neat is where you do have these kind of baked in options for Windows, for Android, such as not being rooted, or for iOS, such as not being jailbroken or requiring pins. You can actually go a lot further than this with custom compliance. Custom compliance policies are ones where you define a script to be ran on the machine, and that script has to return a key value pair in JSON, which is just a dictionary in PowerShell or hash table, and the compliance can be checked against that, which means you're able to write a script to look for any particular antivirus, any particular settings on the machine, really anything that could be gleaned from a script running on that machine, you can bring into compliance. and actually check for. So this is how like third-party antiviruses, third-party MDMs, anything that could trigger an alert about that machine, any type of SIEM, anything like that can be reached out to, for example, in the script from that machine, and then returned back to Intune to be used for compliance assessment. It's also really good if you have a certain security system that has to be on machines before they're allowed to access your information. You can force that, and until Intune sees that and knows that that is on that machine, they are not allowed to access your resources. Our conditional access policies basically say bring your stuff up to date or jump into one of our jump boxes, which we have a different compliance standards for those since they are virtualized and don't have a TPM chip, for example. All right. And this is pretty much how you can kind of get into that whole, your device has to meet the compliance standards as well as be a known device that was issued to you by the organization. Otherwise, you have to jump through jump boxes to access anything corporate, and those have their own security mechanisms and are monitored. All right. Another good use case for compliance policies that we're in the process of implementing now is the minimum OS patch version. You are able to define your minimum patch version, and any devices that are not, for example, kept up to date cannot access your information. All of these conditional access and the adherence to them all show up in the login data for that user. So if you go into the login data, you can go to their user logins, go to device information, and that will list if the device is known, compliant, etc. Hey, and let's just kind of run through one real quick just to kind of see what we're playing with. So we're going to create a Windows 10 policy, and let's call this one test compliance. Okay, so you can kind of see here the different settings that you're able to do, as well as your custom kind of compliance. So there's your minimum OS version numbers before being marked in compliant, as well as certain settings such as if they have a PIN number, if it's encrypted, if the firewall's on, etc. And then also requiring the device score for Defender for Endpoint. There's a custom compliance areas I just mentioned before. It's just going to run a custom script, and that script's going to tell it if it's in compliance or not, which is, I'm sure some of you can kind of piece together. That opens up quite a lot of different options. If you have any applications that have to be on your machines, that's a good place to put them, as well as the remediation efforts within Intune. But we'll kind of get into that in a different one. All right, let's see here. Next is going to be patching. So as we kind of mentioned here, that looking for minimum OS version. Also, Intune also has capabilities for managing your update policies. Those are handled through two different ways. The most common and most popular, just because it's the older one, is the Intune update rings. These are policies set within your Windows area. You'll have these update rings down here where you can relatively easily say how long they should be deferred, which one should go to them, et cetera, and allow you to split them up accordingly. These have to be manually kind of maintained, but other than that, they are relatively straightforward. Auto patch, which is the replacement for this setup, actually takes all of these elements out, and Microsoft handles it for the most part. And what I mean by that is they divide up your rings automatically between I believe a 0, a 90, a 50, no, I'm sorry, a 0, 70, a 30, and a 10, or 20 and a 10, I believe. And those are your machines that get the updates absolutely first, and then the biggest one being the ones that get the updates absolutely last. And so putting your executives, for example, in the last and putting your IT folks in the start allows you guys to kind of check and see if updates would break anything prior to them rolling out to your entire user base. And you don't really have to maintain it, because any new users added to auto patch automatically get automatically assigned to whichever one of those groups is not currently meeting their threshold. So what that means is if it is divided up into, let's say, 70, 20, and 10, and you only have 5 people in that 10 group, the next 5 machines you add are going to go into that 10 group until it levels out. If it's already above 10, then they're going to go into the other groups until it levels out. So there's a little bit of manual configuration at the very start to make sure your executives and your IT staff are where they need to be. But once set up, you can pretty much just let it go, and it will automatically assign people accordingly. And then obviously you want to be mindful and have a person or two set on the absolute newest, which will never get automatically assigned. And they're the ones that will tell you if there's going to be an issue on updates, and then you can stop the updates before they roll out to your organization and save you a ton of trouble. And if it doesn't break anything, you don't have to worry about it. It's just one less thing. As well as you combine them with your conditional access policies, looking for that version number on your OSs, and yeah, you're pretty off to the races. All right. So in terms of kind of tips tips and tricks around Intune and around these MDM enrollments. There's a couple of them. First and foremost, when looking in here, you're going to see these security baselines. This was a good idea by Microsoft. However, it was very, very poorly implemented. And I cannot stress enough, I would highly suggest using these only as references and not use them in conjunction with configuration policies. The reason being that there are certain settings inside of here that are not manageable, meaning that there are more settings than what you see here, and you can't change them. In the configuration profiles, if you accidentally select any of the hidden settings that would exist in this baseline, you're going to have a conflict and it won't apply. So it's just generally better to use these as kind of a, where should I start or what could I implement, and apply those to configuration profiles. Alternatively, you can use the baselines, just be extremely careful about mixing and matching and be watching out for conflicts. Let's see, next is going to be, yes, in terms of configuration profile, in terms of deploying application. When deploying applications, it is important not to mix Win32 with line of business. And what I mean by that is when adding apps in here, you have this option for line of business app, which is basically a watered down version of Win32 with no options, which if you have just a straight MSI will work. However, if you mix line of business apps and Win32 when deploying applications, you will start seeing issues of speed in terms of getting these applications rolled out. For whatever reason, if both of these are on a policy targeted the same machine, it's not happy. Let's say it that way. And it can take a little while for those apps to deploy the way you would expect. Other than that, also app deployments when deploying to users as your target. Try to target users if at all possible, as those are checked every 15 minutes. Device memberships and whatnot are checked only every 48 hours. And lastly, don't target a dynamic group. If at all possible, use a filter, which if you have any questions around those, please let me know at the end of this and we will go back through here and I'll kind of show you what that actually looks like. And then lastly, don't mix users and groups for targeting. And that's true on pretty much any part of this, either it be apps or configuration profiles. Don't mix and match the targeting devices and excluding users or vice versa. Stick to one or the other. You either target and exclude users or target and exclude devices, or include both. But yes, basically don't target users with the included and target devices with the exclude. It's going to cause problems too. Those are the vast majority of the issues we tend to run into when investigating issues. So let's kind of get into BYOD and enrollment. All right, so as you may know, there are 4 main operating systems, at least they're classified in general, 4 operating systems that you'll generally have to deal with around MDM. Those are going to be your Windows, Apple, and Android. Now, granted, I split Apple into 2, but generally those are just those 3. iOS, Mac OS being Apple. Windows, the enrollment process can be relatively straightforward. They range from the silent hybrid AD joining enrollment, which we try to steer somewhat away from because of the delay in Intune enrollment. It can take a couple of days and you can tend to only have 10 enrolled at each day and it just slowly kind of creep in. Alternatively, Windows can be enrolled by directly Azure AD joining a machine to your tenant. And if that user is licensed for Intune and it is enabled, they will be automatically registered in Intune. And that does work in environments, for example, that are still running legacy servers and legacy like group policy, for example, because you are able to use an Azure AD join machine in your environment using domain creds. You just have to enable that Kerberos server object. And then so long as their identity is synced from your on-prem, if they're on an Azure AD join machine, it will be able to go through your network and use a Kerberos ticket like everyone else. And you have easier times onboarding with Intune and a few others. But those are generally those are the 2 main ways. The third way is obviously just to install the company portal app on the device itself, either through group policy or through any number of mechanisms. And once it's logged into on the company portal app, it will onboard them that way. And the company portal app is onboarding that way, pretty much regardless of the operating system, which is why I left it for last on the Windows. In terms of Android can be enrolled automatically via Knox, which is similar to DEP or to Autopilot. Additionally, it can actually, by default, be enrolled via the personally owned device with work profile. This is your default profile, and this is probably the one you're going to want to stick with unless you have certain use cases. The devices with work profile work by slicing the phone basically in half. I use it on my Android phone, for example, and I have a work area in my phone and I have a personal area in my phone. And if I open up my apps, I just can switch between the two. And none of the business stuff, none of the work apps can send data to the personal side, which can get kind of interesting at times, running into your own security mechanisms that you set up. But I can't, for example, copy an address from a work email and then try to paste it in my maps. But that's just because of how strict our policies are. You can obviously adjust that. Personally owned devices with work profile is our recommended Android enrollment because it won't allow the IT staff to see or delete any personal information on that device. They can only remove what's in the work profile. It automatically segments itself off. And more importantly, the cool part is if you have a conditional access policy enforcing only known and registered devices and an Android device hits it, it will actually go ahead and prompt them to set up that work profile for you automatically. And you don't need to run around touching all your Android devices to roll out that solution. Just make sure you have the apps that they may need ready to go in your profiles, because when it slices them down the middle, like down the Androids, they can only install what is allowed in that work profile, which you define. Other than that, there's other ones such as the full corporate owned dedicated devices. These are generally used for your kiosk or your one app tablets. And then we have our corporate owned devices work profiles. We don't see that often, as generally users or IT staff are wanting to wipe company devices after the users used it and redeploy it. So we actually don't see that one very often. And then our legacy ones is if you see anything with Android Device Administrator, these are your legacy. These are going to be a lot of your older Android phones and any devices that are running Android that are not up to date all the way in terms of the operating system that they're on. Not to say that they're not up to date based on the manufacturer, just that the operating system of Android is of an older type. So those would be like your Polycoms, your handheld phones, etc. Those more than likely will use this kind of legacy, full-blown permissions across the board device enrollment type. And they will automatically try to do that. Now, in order to control kind of which ones are allowed, you have your device platform restrictions. This basically allows you to define which enrollment types are allowed for certain people. So for example, we may have different policies allowing, let's say, personally owned for all our users because we don't issue Android devices here, versus the enrollment restrictions that we would have for our conference room and team phones. They would need the older kind of legacy device administration, and we'd want to block that work profile. So that's your enrollment restrictions around Android. Now, to get to the actual fun one, and that's going to be iOS and macOS, because like everything in the corporate world, Mac will find a way to make it difficult. They'll find it. We basically have a few different enrollment types, as well as a bunch of limitations around them. As mentioned at the start, enrollments can also be done through DEP. For those that aren't familiar, DEP/autopilot/Knox is just the mechanism used for the automatic enrollment of devices once purchased from your manufacturer. They basically will submit the hardware hash if it's autopilot, or if it's Apple, they'll submit the serial number into Apple Business Manager. When that device powers on, out-of-box experience fires up and reaches out. If it sees that its information is somewhere, it will tell it to go ahead and enroll in your corresponding MDM. And you can do that with any of these. Having said that, the iOS side of this can get a little tricky because you have about 4 different enrollment types, and they all have certain catches and they all have certain limitations. So I'm just going to kind of rattle them off. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll be more than happy to flesh this out a little bit further. You have user enrollment with company portal. That's what we described earlier, where installing company portal on the actual device itself and logging in will enroll it. The snag with that is it will need a managed Apple ID. You also have account-driven user enrollment. And account-driven user enrollment requires the federation of Apple Business Manager. So again, it needs managed Apple IDs, but even one step further than that, those managed Apple IDs have to be federated, which is a whole other thing. But that is the account-driven user enrollment is the closest to the work profile setup that the Androids have. The negatives there, though, the authenticator has to be re-registered on the iOS device. It's not automatically set up at all on first challenge like the Android side would be. But it's also one of the only ways you can enroll an iOS device, and the IT staff would not have the ability to wipe personal data, which is the big kind of red flag in iOS/Mac onboarding. So user enrollment with company portal, for example, can wipe the phone. Account-driven user enrollment, IT staff cannot. Device enrollment with company portal, the IT staff can wipe the device. We also have web-based enrollment. That's generally around your JAMP MDMs, not necessarily around Intune. We've already talked about DEP. And that's really the gist of it. So I say all that to say this. If you have any concern of your IT staff being able to wipe personal data on your iOS devices, you basically have a choice between federating Apple Business Manager, setting up account-driven user enrollment, resetting authenticator on the people who need it, or you can look into MAM policies instead and actually protect the data instead of trying to protect the device. But we'll actually get into that when we get to the data pillar in Zero Trust, because it's really going to be dependent on your organization what the most appropriate route to go. If you have company-owned iOS devices, this is not a concern. Throw them in DEP, set up Apple Business Manager, get them all set up to where you don't have to worry about onboarding, and get it to the point where you just reset them when they're given to the next person and not have to worry about it again. But personal iOS devices can get a little hairy, since by default, if they were just thrown into Intune, any IT staff could accidentally wipe the entire personal device, including baby pictures. And I'm sure anybody who's seen someone accidentally lose their baby pictures knows how dramatic that can be. So what I'm gonna do here is go to my login history, and we'll just kind of show how this login information shows up, how it's parsed. And again, all of this kind of happens in the background. Your users don't really see it, and that's kind of the idea, is we want to prevent MFA exhaustion wherever possible. So any mechanisms we're able to use to do so, try to. So let me get my login history up, and apologies. These are going to be my sign-in, so you can kind of see success. So what I'm going to do is try to find one. If I have not used my phone today, I have not. Well, I was going to use my phone, but I'll use my laptop. All right, so we can kind of see here that on my laptop, I go to device info, we can see my operating system, that I am currently compliant, that I am a managed machine, that my join type is Azure AD joined, as well as all the location information. Why this is important is because if, for example, in the device compliance, we are checking that my machine score, for example, is not past a certain threshold, which I'm obviously not, so I'm not allowed access. But this kind of shows you how that kind of all kind of flows together with Defender for Endpoint, which I'm going to actually take a side step real quick and actually show you a couple of pieces of Defender for Endpoint, just in case no one's ever shown you, as it is a rather useful piece of software, especially around the EDR and AV side. So I'm just going to show you an example, some of the features and what's actually feeding that conditional access. And again, we're really looking at this enhancement of the request, because again, each one of these logins to an area is bringing over all that information, as well as being enhanced by the threat protection policies that we're going to be reviewing here very shortly. So let's go to our dashboard. This is a very, very useful, actually, I'll start with recommendations. This is a very, very useful piece of, I want to call it security technology, but really it's a layer within the Defender for Endpoint application. And what it does is the vulnerability recommendations are great because they index every CVE, then index everything that's installed on any of your machines and tell you what you need to update within your environment, because it's what's exposing you the most. So for example, right now, I know I have 30 people who need the latest update to their Chrome. Now Chrome's set to automatically update, so this will automatically resolve itself probably in the next day or two. But this is a good example of where you can see that CVE has been released. You even have the associated CVEs for that. That was released January 1. Which devices have that current vulnerability and how long it's been exposed. So with this, as well as your impact in terms of reducing your exposure score. So I wanted to share this because this works very well in terms of just telling you these are the most vulnerable pieces within your environment. Okay, so I have, for example, 9 Macs that also need their Chromes updated. This is very useful, but this does not necessarily tie into the machine risk scores. The risk scores, as we were describing them as it relates to conditional access are really around alerts, not necessarily like vulnerability management. But I just wanted to kind of show that these are the kind of pieces that are all kind of playing together to ensure that the devices that are accessing your corporate information are ones that you know are yours, that are abiding by your security standards and that are up to date to your specifications. And you're able to say, no, you cannot access information until you meet these standards. All right. So let's see where else we got. I went over BYOD. It went over this, tying into that, and we went over the recommendations for vulnerability. Additionally, there's a place in here, I'm trying to find it real quick, that I would highly suggest you guys also review, and that is your kind of security recommendations, not the patches. That might be this one. Okay, so it's patches and policies. Yep. Inside these recommendations, I would also highly suggest there are certain policies in here that they'll basically say you should recommend that you enable these, and those are your attack surface reduction rules. Many of these will actually tell you if they believe that this would actually cause a problem. Let me see if I can find one, because I believe we go through this pretty often. These are left open because they haven't killed basic auth yet on PowerShell scripts for 365, and so we can't kill that one off yet. I do not have one. Okay. Yeah, I was hoping I could find one for you, but on some of these, they will actually tell you the percentage of potential impacts that it would have with your environment to do that. We currently enable about 2 or 3 of these a week, and then test them, roll them back if we find any issues, and we're just constantly improving this. And I would highly suggest you do the same. All right, so let's go to these policies. So as we kind of went over as it relates to identity, this does kind of touch on it a little bit. As soon as my policies will load, come on. Okay, so as we were discussing previous, we have a geo block login here. And this is something we'd also kind of highly suggest. The vast majority of attacks around American enterprises generally come from outside the country. So you'd be shocked at how many attacks you can stop just by blocking access from other countries. And when you're in this kind of model, you can get kind of fancy because you can exclude, for example, known devices within your environment. Such as like requiring them to be compliant if they are out of the country. We do a hard block here. We just prefer if your account's going to be used anywhere outside the country to let us know, and we put in an exemption for you while you're outside the country, because we just never want to risk our usernames or anything like that being used anywhere else. But obviously, as you kind of see here, we're able to say that the device itself would have to be compliant, and you could, for example, have it where no logins are allowed outside the country unless it's from a device that's known and compliant to your organization. And that can actually act as a form of MFA, since multi-factor authentication, they'd have to have the user credentials as well as a company-owned and registered device to them, acting as a second factor. Let's see, but as kind of described in terms of geolocation, you're able to go into your locations and define outside the US would block access for them, unless you can meet certain criteria, which you can set accordingly. So, and you also set your own IP ranges if need be for exemptions and whatnot. But that's generally how you do geo kind of filtering, and how it would relate to possibly having a known device that is meeting compliance, be able to bypass this so that you wouldn't have to manually add in people who are traveling. Although we like to do it on our side just because we're paranoid like that. All right. I believe in terms of devices, without going super deep into any certain enrollment type or any certain operating system or any certain type of policy or configuration policy, I believe that's it.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.